Welcome to Storytime with Texas Red. I'm Paul Halperin, also known as Texas Red, and I'm going to read you another one of my true stories. The title of this story is JFK and Abbott Vaughn Meader. This is a story about two brief moments in my life and the memorable events that occurred during each one. Let me set the scenes. The first event was when I was a high school senior, and it was less than 24 hours before one of the most momentous events in world history. The second event, a decade later, was when I was a blues musician and I was in a room with a man who for a brief period in American history was a cultural icon. Okay, here's the story. I was born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, and I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood on the north side of San Antonio near Thomas Jefferson High School. Because of its size and reputation, the high school actually plays a part in this story. Jefferson was one of the grandest and most expensive schools in Texas, and its architecture has been nationally recognized for its stunning Spanish Moorish revival design. Jefferson was completed in 1932 at a cost of $1,250,000. Now, for perspective, that translates to about $20 million in 2025. Jefferson was featured on the cover of Life magazine in the issue dated October 16, 1939. The article showcased the school as an example of an outstanding American high school. I entered Jefferson, or Jeff as it was known, in September 1961, less than a month after my 15th birthday. I was already driving to school. You could get a full driver's license at 14 in Texas. I had a green 1956 Ford Crown Victoria four-door sedan. It was a tank with automatic transmission and no power steering or power brakes. Jeff was a huge school, about 3,000 in the student body, and I was really apprehensive about walking into that new environment. I just didn't want to fuck it up. In Texas, this was the big time. Our football team, the Jefferson Mustangs, was legendary. The Texas high school football experience has been romanticized in one show after another. And at the end of every week, we all celebrated the ritual of Friday Night Lights at Alamo Stadium next to Trinity University, not far from downtown San Antonio. I was assigned to Ms. Barron's advisory, and that would be my base of operations at Jeff. Barron would be the guide for my high school experience. She was in her 30s, good-natured, with a warm personality, and fortunately, she had a great sense of humor. She was a biology teacher, and biology with Miss Barron was my first period every morning. That's how I started my day. Ms. Barron found out quickly that self-control was not my strong suit. In the fourth grade in elementary school, on my report card, I actually received failing grades in all categories of deportment or behavior. I had a reputation for my constant outbursts and wisecracks and for generally instigating chaos. I'd even been disciplined by the principal. I was the stereotypical class clown. As I mentioned, it was just lucky that Ms. Barron had a sense of humor and thought my acting out was funny. Instead of discipline, she had a better idea. She actually supported my craziness. And that changed my life. She believed my wise-ass behavior would be appreciated in the journalism department under the direction of a woman who was admired throughout the campus, Ms. Alma Petrick. Ms. Petrick oversaw the production of the school newspaper named The Declaration and the yearbook named Monticello or Monticello. Remember, it's Thomas Jefferson High School. Ms. Barron and Ms. Petrick handled the details, and my advisory was changed from Barron and biology to Petrick and journalism. So every day, instead of going to the biology classroom for advisory, I would go to the journalism office, which was 2 connecting rooms, one for the paper and one for the yearbook. I worked on the Declaration in a number of capacities, including writing, layout, and making runs to the printer with the paper's layout. We all pitched in. It was a communal effort because due to class schedules, the entire staff couldn't be in the office at the same time. I became friends with Bill the cartoonist. We shared the same sense of humor. There was no shortage of joking and good-natured pandemonium in the office, and through it all, Bill and I developed a unique rapport. Ms. Petrick was often a participant. She had a great sense of humor and always put up with our shenanigans. It was a creative environment, and chaos was part of the process. It was now the fall of 1961, and I was situated in the journalism department under Ms. Petrick. But for now, I'm going to save stories about the majority of my high school experience for future episodes. There will be stories about my academic experience, how I started drinking, the friends I made and the girlfriends I had, the music that became part of my life, and ultimately how I prepared for college. But now I'm going to jump ahead 2 years to November 1963 and talk about the first significant event I mentioned at the beginning of this episode. Bill and I were now seniors, and our roles at the paper had made significant strides. We had taken leadership roles, and when it came time to elect the new editor-in-chief for the upcoming school year, Bill and I decided to run for election together, and we won. We were elected co-editors-in-chief and now ranked among the highest student body positions, along with student council president, commander of the ROTC, editor of the yearbook, and other major student organizations. Bill and I were admitted to Quill and Scroll Journalism Honor Society. On Thursday, November 21st, 1963, the Jefferson High School Journalism Department took a field trip to Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio to hear a speech by President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Kennedy was there to dedicate the School of Aerospace Medicine at Brooks Air Force Base. Work was already underway for a new era of space travel. In the car on the way to Brooks, we were all ecstatic that we were actually going to see the president we all idolized. President Kennedy, First Lady Jackie Kennedy, and their children had changed the image of Washington and the presidency. They had captured the hearts of the American people. The address was outdoors. The president spoke from behind a podium on stage to a large crowd of press, military, and civilians. We hung on every word as the president spoke, and we applauded enthusiastically at the conclusion. Following the address was a scene that would definitely not happen today. There was no security for the audience attending the event. President Kennedy walked a rope line, shaking hands and speaking briefly to members of the audience. When he came to me, I reached out, and as he shook my hand, I said, "I really enjoyed your speech, Mr. President." When I got home, I told my parents, "I'm never washing my hand again. I just shook hands with President Kennedy." My parents were elated. They were huge fans of the president and his family. The next day, Friday, November 22nd, 1963, at a little after 12:30 p.m., it had been less than 24 hours since I shook hands with the president, and I was sitting in chemistry class with 30 friends and classmates and our teacher, Mr. Cottingham. We all heard the familiar sound when the PA mic in the principal's office opens and there's going to be a school-wide announcement. Our principal came on the mic and asked for our attention. After a short pause, the principal said that President Kennedy had just been assassinated in Dallas. I will never forget what Cottingham said at that moment. He said, "The only tragedy is that it didn't happen sooner." I was devastated and furious, Like so many Americans, I was in awe of President Kennedy, and just the day before, I'd expressed my appreciation to him in person, even shook his hand. In 60 plus years, I haven't gotten over what Cottingham said that afternoon. In today's political environment, the blowback on him would likely be career-ending. I wrote an editorial for the Declaration, which we placed on the front page of the paper beneath a photograph of JFK that was taken by our staff photographer at Brooks on November 21st. The title of my editorial was "Hate Breeds Violence." Despite the widespread adoration of JFK, there was an opposite sentiment in the country. Shortly thereafter, Ms. Petrick presented me with a letter from the superintendent of schools in San Antonio. In the letter, addressed to me, the superintendent thanked me, and he was very complimentary about the editorial. When I got home from school that day, I showed the letter to my parents, and needless to say, they were very proud. When I started this episode, I said it was about two momentous events in my life. The first was when I shook hands with President Kennedy on November 21st, 1963, less than 24 hours before he was assassinated. The second event, in mid-1973, a decade later, was when I was a blues musician living in Louisville, Kentucky. My blues band was playing around town, and one of our gigs was at 100 Washington, a club downtown on Washington Street on the Ohio River. It was one of our better gigs. It had primarily been a jazz club, and it was more upscale than the rock and roll bars we usually played. There was a lounge area toward the front of the club, like a piano bar. As we arrived to set up for our gig one evening, there was a guy playing piano and singing, basically doing a happy hour lounge act. I stopped to introduce myself. He said his name was Abbott. I introduced myself as Texas Red. I soon found out that his full name was Abbott Vaughn Meader, and I realized that in the early 60s, he was the person who became a national superstar impersonating President John F. Kennedy. At that time, he went by Vaughn Meader. He was everywhere, TV, magazines, every type of media. Along with a comedy group, Meader created the record album titled The First Family, doing a send-up of the entire Kennedy family. The album captured the attention of the nation. We had the album at my house. Meader was everywhere. He rose to stardom with appearances in all media, including the ultimate appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Abbott and I became friends. We happened to be neighbors in the popular Cherokee Triangle neighborhood of Louisville. Abbott lived in an apartment with his wife, a former Playboy bunny. The neighborhood was more like a community with an array of musicians and other artists. But the fact is, Abbott's life had steadily declined since the Kennedy assassination. He was 38, playing piano at happy hour in a lounge in downtown Louisville. Famously, there are two accounts of Lenny Bruce's opening comment on stage right after the Kennedy assassination. One account is that Bruce walked out on stage in a club in Manhattan and said, "Man, poor Vaughn Meader." Another account was that he came out and said, "Vaughn Meader is fucked." According to Meader's ex-wife, Abbott had descended into drugs and drinking. The drugs she mentioned were cocaine, pot, and psilocybin. The last time I saw Abbott was when my friend Greg and I went to his apartment one afternoon to hang out. Greg and I had already been smoking hash and drinking beer, so we were really high by the time Abbott opened the front door, greeted us, and invited us into the living room. Abbott, formerly Vaughn Meader, the man I saw on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was 16 years old, took a seat in an armchair while Greg and I sat on the couch. We were now in the presence of a man who had been a household name a decade before. We watched Abbott pull a piece of crumpled aluminum foil from the pocket of his jeans. He opened it, and we could see it was full of white powder, but we didn't know what it was. Without hesitation, Abbott snorted the entire contents and immediately went into what I can only describe as a trance. Later, we figured it could have been PCP, often called angel dust. Almost immediately, Abbott's legs stuck straight out in front of him. He didn't speak. He was transfixed. Greg and I were already high from smoking hash and drinking beer. We looked at each other nervously and assessed the situation for maybe a minute. Things had gotten very weird. We were high and paranoid about contacting anyone. We had drugs, plus Greg was a drug dealer. We looked at each other, wide-eyed, and without speaking, we knew there was only one thing to do. It was like a scene from Cheech and Chong, or Dumb and Dumber, or Beavis and Butthead. We got up and left. I have no idea what happened after that, but I do know that Abbott passed away on October 29th, 2004, at the age of 68. He passed away from heart failure in a hospital in Bangor, Maine.